Okay, today I have with me Ray McGovern, and we are going to get into some very important stories that are in the news right now. Ray, thank you so much for being on today's show.
You're most welcome.
So I first saw you scrolling on YouTube. You were giving a briefing to the United Nations Security Council about your thoughts on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I found your words to be very insightful and interesting. I told my wife, I want to get that guy on my show. And then it ended up taking me, another 6 to 8 weeks to be able to track you down. And so I'm grateful to have you on. And we're going to talk about Russia and Ukraine and your background with the CIA. Just really briefly, you've been a part of Washington, D.C. since President John F. Kennedy all the way up through President Bush. 27 years of working and serving the country with the CIA. You were a part of those presidential security briefings. Tell me just a little bit about how you got started. I know that President John F. Kennedy inspired you. So maybe just tell the viewers that, and then we'll jump into the Nord Stream 2 pipeline sabotage story.
Sure, and thanks for having me, Steve. I majored in Russian undergraduate because I was totally bored with French, and we had to take a modern language. The 5 years of Greek and the 6 years of Latin somehow didn't qualify. So anyhow, at Fordham University, they had a really good Russian program, and I took a master's degree there as well. Then when I had to do my 2 years of Army intelligence officer, it was an infantry intelligence officer duty, the CIA hired me on. I was able to enter the CIA before I actually completed the 2 years. The CIA paid the Army for what they paid me as a second lieutenant. And so I got an early start in applying my Russian. And my first account was Sino-Soviet relations, a very, very big account. I don't know how I looked into it, but it got my career off to a good start. I later became head of the branch, the Soviet foreign policy branch at CIA. So I was involved in 70, 71, 72 with supporting what we call the SALT talks, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, which resulted in the first ABM treaty. I was there in Moscow when that was signed. It was an exhilarating event because I knew that it would result in decades of stability. It's not so nice to depend on the fear of the other person striking, but when you could be sure that the other person knew damn well that they couldn't escape in retaliatory strike, then there was the stability. For reasons unknown to me, George Bush the Younger just left the treaty in 2002. And then Trump left the Intermediate Forces Treaty in 2019, and we ended up with nothing to constrain the growth of anti-ballistic missiles or even what the Russians call strategic strike missiles that can reach Moscow or their ICBM force in, get this now, 5 to 7 minutes now. When we get hypersonic missiles, 5 minutes. So this is the danger. Even Putin made the point years ago that Ukrainian membership in NATO is bad enough, but even more important, said he, was the prospect of having offensive strike missiles in place in Crimea. Now, they're already, the capsules, the holes are already in place in Romania, and in Poland. What do I mean? Well, these are people. These are emplacements that are disguised or justified as ABM sites, but what they are is exact configurations for what Putin calls tomahawk missiles.
Okay.
Those are the 7 to 10 minutes warning time, or eventually hypersonic missiles, which could reach 5 minutes. Okay. Now let me just. This is hard for Americans to understand. This is a existential threat to Russia of the same kind that President Kennedy faced when Khrushchev tried to put offensive strike missiles of intermediate range in Cuba.
Okay.
Minutes from Washington, minutes from SAC headquarters in Omaha, minutes, okay? So the notion that this was, what Putin ended up doing was unprovoked. Well, you need to be consistent about that. Is what Kennedy did, was that unprovoked? Provoked up the kazoo, for God's sake, Nobody said, President Kennedy, you're overreacting, I mean, this is, it's not provoked. Of course it was provoked. Not only that, but some of my friends were in the invasion force preparing to go in from Key West. And, the U.S. was threatening nuclear war. It was not supposed to do that under the UN Charter. So it was provoked as could be. And I make the case that Putin now, and as he watches these little capsules go into Romania and Poland, that he figures that's the kind of existential threat that justified illegal things by Kennedy. I mean, blockade, that's illegal, okay? And I'm not saying that this is a good thing. Of course, it's a terrible thing. Ukrainians are dying by the droves. But, to suggest that it was unprovoked, it's a lie. And the head of the CIA knows this in a personal way because he was braced in 2008 by the young foreign minister at the time, Sergei Lavrov, who said, Mr. Burns, do you know what "niet" means? "Niet" means no Ukraine in NATO. 2 months later, NATO decided Ukraine and Georgia, the country of Georgia, will become members of NATO. So that was 2008. Now it's 2023. What's Bill Burns saying now as head of the CIA? Well, now he's saying this was completely unprovoked. His cable from Moscow, from Embassy Moscow, which we have courtesy of WikiLeaks, and if I've seen one cable from Embassy Moscow, I've seen about 5,000 in my career. It's authentic. It indicates that what Sergei Lavrov told Bill Burns on February 1, 2008, was that if you make Ukraine or try to make Ukraine a member of NATO, there'll be civil war there, and we will have to decide whether we have to invade. Okay. Now, so he says, if you provoke us, we'll have to decide whether to do this. So all I'm saying is that the CIA and the rest of the intelligence establishment have become kind of a propagandist weapon rather than telling the president the truth about these things. And the president, to the degree he's compos mentis, is being woefully misled.
Okay, so then Biden is being fed information from maybe NSA, FBI, CIA, and this war didn't just suddenly happen last February. This was for over a decade, letting the American people, NATO, Ukraine, Europe know, if you move in, we're going to move in. So that's why you're saying that this was unprovoked, because they've been saying for over a decade exactly what they would do.
Well, yes. And, it's not so much the juridical aspect of becoming a member of NATO. Of course, that would be important. It's the fact that Ukraine was being made into a de facto member of NATO. What people don't know is that Ukrainian forces were being trained and equipped with the highest trainers and the highest equipment possible. They were probably the best NATO force in Europe, okay? And they were massing next to the Donbass, the two republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, in January and February of 2022, ready to pounce on those Russian speakers that decided they didn't want to live under the coup regime in Kiev. And that was part of the calculus that Putin was faced with. You know, they discarded our efforts to do a kind of a new treaty, a new arrangement where everyone's core interests in Europe would be safeguarded, including ours. They've refused to do that. Now they're gearing up for an attack on Donbass. The neo-Nazis are very much in control in Kiev. And last but not least, Steve, and this is really important, Putin goes up to Beijing for the beginning of the Winter Olympics and has a long talk with best friend Xi Jinping on the 4th of February last year. And what do they say? Well, here's how I think the conversation went. Putin, we can't trust the Americans. They're gearing up to encourage the Ukrainian army to attack Donbass. They diddled us for 8 years with the Minsk Accords, and now they brag about it openly. Merkel of Germany, Hollande of France, Poroshenko from Ukraine, even Zelensky, they're bragging about how they made us think they were serious while they built up their forces. And I think I'm going to have to clean them out before they start attacking our compatriots. What do you think, Xi? Now, my impression of Xi Jinping was, you mean after the Olympics are over, right, Vladimir?
Yes, I remember this now. Okay.
Putin said, oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. The Olympics are over on the 22nd of February. Russia recognizes Donbass, that is Donetsk and Lugansk, as independent nations on the 23rd, and on the 24th, of course, is the invasion, limited military operation or a special military operation. It was limited. I mean, there was no chance that 185,000 Russian troops are going to take over Ukraine. People don't understand that, but that's the fact. Now it's a much bigger deal. Now it's a much bigger deal for many reasons. And the denouement, mark my words, is coming, I'd say, another 6 to 8 weeks, where the Russians will be all the way up to the Dnieper River, which is the natural divide between West and East Ukraine. And the U.S. is going to have to decide how to react. Can they back down then? Can they talk to Zelensky and say, okay, the jig's up here, we need to deal? Or will they escalate? And how could they escalate? And what would that do with respect to Russian response? I mean, will there be a wider war in Europe? That's really up to the guys who are telling Biden what to do. And no other than Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin has called these guys sumashetsky, okay? Sumashetsky is the Russian word. Out of is mind, shetsky, walking out of your mind, okay? They're crazy. Now, that's not healthy. I mean, it doesn't care whether McGovern thinks they're crazy, and I have to share that. I do think they're elite and they're exceptional, and they think they can work their will on the rest of the world, and they can't. Okay, so they're benighted. But what counts is what Putin and what Xi think. And my notion about what they did for those 5 hours, just these past days in Moscow, meeting secretly. Well, I think it's clear. They were preparing contingency plans for when the balloon goes up or balloon comes down in Ukraine, and the Russian army is moving forward in a way that's inexorable. What does Putin do when the U.S. reacts? And what does China do to support Putin? because that's how close they are. And China, of course, knows that it's next. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the main enemy. They're going to get rid of this little guy Putin first, then China's next in line. So it's just been a tectonic shift in what the old Soviets used to call the correlation of world forces. Okay, it's China and Russia now against the United States, and that's not good. It's it's awfully not good
Yeah.
if our policymakers don't understand it or can't bring themselves to think that the situation has changed. The U.S. is no longer exceptional.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me about that Olympics. I remember reading that and seeing that, and I kind of put it in the back of my mind. But so you think that maybe while they were in the Olympics in China, Putin was letting Xi Jinping know, these are my plans. I want your blessing. Are you guys going to back us before they go in? And then now here they are. They've just met, and it's to do this 12-point peace plan where Ukraine gives up land, there's a ceasefire, but you think that they might also be creating a plan B or a contingent plan on what to do if the reaction isn't to go for peace or back down?
Oh, well, Steve, you're right. This is really an important juncture. Now, Putin was responding to a longstanding invitation from Xi to help open the Olympics. That was the 4th of February, so 20 days before the invasion. Now, I'm not, I'm not sure of this. This is speculation on my part, but I think what eventuated, including the last couple of days with Xi in Moscow, shows that the Chinese decided, well, they would support Russia in this. I don't think personally that Putin would have gone ahead if he didn't think that China had his back. Okay, I can't prove that. Yeah.
Okay.
And some Chinese diplomats have said, "Oh no, Russia didn't tell us." Russia, no. What would you expect the Chinese to say? Oh yeah, Russia told us. Yeah. So anyhow, I think that the way things worked out was that if you look at it in strategic terms, uh, the crucible for China has been the concepts of Westphalia, sovereignty, inviolability of borders. You don't invade other countries. The sanctity of the post-Westphalian order. Okay, and in effect, since China knows it's number 2 on the list for U.S. blandishments, they gave Putin a waiver on Westphalia and said, you got to do what you got to do. We'll support you. Now, they didn't wave their flags and said, yeah, we support Putin. But they did say, they changed their rhetoric at the same time. Instead of saying inviolability, sanctity of international borders, they said, on core interests, each country is allowed to judge what to do on its own merits, on the situation's own merits. Wow, that was a new formulation. Now, we criminologists, pick this language apart. And when the Chinese say for 40 years, Westphalia, no violation of international borders, and then all of a sudden say, well, on core interests, like Russia is against the West in NATO, and like ours against the U.S. in Taiwan, and core interests, you respond by judging what your own interests are. So that plus all the support, historical and otherwise, that China has given, economic support, and their relationship has never been closer. And just to tell you where I'm coming from here, as they say these days, in 1963, my first portfolio was Sino-Soviet relations. I haven't mentioned that before. I saw them at their worst. Total trade turnover in 1 year, I think it was 64 or 60, 1964, 65, 200 million. Not much. Total trade turnover this year, guess what? 200 billion with a B. Okay. Now, I try to do the math, and I checked this with my mathematician son, and he said, "Yeah, that's right. That's 1,000 times more." Okay,
Wow.
so that's just one indication of how close they are. They both feel threatened by the same power, that's the United States. NATO is trying to expand in some weird way the North Atlantic Treaty Organization into Australia and Japan and all those. I mean, crazy is not far from the mark.
Yeah. I want to move on to the Nord Stream, but I mean, you bring up so many really great points. China could very easily say, "Hey, every country's on their own. We're not going to get involved. We're the Switzerland of the Ukraine-Russia war." But then they're funding Russia by buying their oil and gold, right?
Yeah.
And that's what's kept that economy from collapsing and the sanctions from having, a little bit of bite versus a big bite. Yeah, very, very astute observation. Okay, so I first saw you giving a briefing with Jeffrey Sachs at the United Nations Security Council on the Nord Stream 2 sabotage. Now we're being led to believe that people in a sailboat with no proof of equipment went down and blew up these steel cement reinforced pipelines in a strategic blast. What are your thoughts on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? We'll just let it go from there. So just give my audience an idea of where you're at with it. With these two, we have Seymour Hersh saying, "I have all of these details. I'm keeping my my person protected and anonymous, but I know that it was President Joe Biden that ordered the hit. It was multiple months. It was with the country of Norway." Now we have Germany and Biden saying, "Oh, it's people in a sailboat."
Pretty funny, isn't it? But not really. Who can believe that the President of the United States would approve this kind of thing? It's an act of war. It destroys a vital pipeline. I think what's $11 billion already, that not only was very lucrative to Russia, but that the Germans depended upon for cheap energy to drive not only their, heating during the winter, but their industry, for God's sake. So it's really hard to believe. But how other can we believe this? Now, here's the situation at the UN. When I was there with Jeffrey Sachs, and they gave us each about 15 minutes to speak, it was clear that the decision was pretty much not going to be made that day. Actually, the president of the council that month was a gentleman or a woman from Malta, and they gave the floor first to the deputy security general of the UN, and she happened to be, by coincidence, an American. Usually is an American. Anyhow, she gave a little introductory thing, and she warned. She said, "Now we're going to discuss this explosive report about explosives, but we're not going to make any conclusions today. There'll be no real analysis to find out who would be. No, we're just gonna got that? No decision today." So I'm sitting there and oh, this is going to be really interesting. Jeffrey Sachs, professor from Columbia University, spoke eloquently. He sort of outlined the whole case. So all I needed to do was fill in some of the blanks. But the idea was, should there be an independent investigation? And of course, Jeffrey said, "Of course there should." I mean, what good is the Security Council of the United Nations if they can't step up to an independent investigation of an act of war of this magnitude, right? And of course, the Russians were arguing that. And the interesting thing was what the Chinese were saying. Okay. Now, realize this, that when we walked in to the Security Council, the Swedes and the Danes and the Germans had given a memo to all the members saying, "We got this covered. We're going to investigate this. We're going to go through it through and through. It's going to be boilerplate. Let's just go. So no need for everything by the see. No, Jeffrey Sachs had already pointed out the Swedes already investigated this. The Swedes know every inch of the bottom of the Baltic Sea right there. Okay. And they sent down divers really well equipped and so forth. And as they come up to the top, everyone said, "What'd you find?" And the Swedes said, "We can't tell you.
Yeah.
It's a secret. It would endanger national security. We're not even going to tell our citizens." It's okay. So that's what the Swedes did. This was back last fall. Now,
Yeah.
now we're going to let the Swedes and the Danes and the Germans. So the whole thing is so ostensibly so obviously wrong. The Chinese delegates said, "Look, if we can't investigate this, what good are we? It's not doesn't suffice to smear the journalists that uncovered this, however distinguished he is. It's necessary to investigate." Now, what will happen? There will be an investigation because there is a UN security resolution. I mean, there won't be an investigation. There'll be a decision. And the decision will be, "Oh, we're going to depend on the Danes and the Swedes and the Germans." Now, I need to talk about Germany because this is the crux of things. When President Biden spoke out on the 7th of February last year, Chancellor Olaf Scholz was right next to him at the next podium. And a very courageous Reuters reporter, a woman, asked the president, "What about this Nord Stream?" And Biden said, "It's not going to go through if there's a Russian invasion of Ukraine." And she said, "Well, good for you to say, but you don't control the pipeline." The Germans said, I promise you, we can do it." Now, background, Cy Hirsch says that Biden and others learned that we could do it physically. We were able to do that about 2 or 3 months before, okay? And they told him, "Please, don't mention this, Mr. President." But Biden, in his typical voluble way, let the cat out of the bag.
His
We
walking
can do,
mind.
I promise you, we can do it, okay? Now, here's the thing. Here's Olaf Scholz, and he's standing at the next podium, and the woman says, in perfect German, she's bilingual, "Chancellor Scholz, was halten Sie davon?" Yeah, Chancellor Scholz, "What do you think about that?" And he looked like the proverbial deer in the headlights, right? And he says, "Well," and then he remembered what he's supposed to say in such occasions. He said, we do everything together. There's nothing that we do that's of any consequence that we don't do together." Now, what's the point here? What did Scholz know? And when did he know it? Did Biden share with him that it was possible to blow up this thing and they would if they wanted to? Or did he not? Either way, it looked pretty bad for Scholz, huh? Yeah. Either he cooperated with this or he was completely surprised by his best ally, who he still insists on walking lockstep with. So the Germans are really upset. People are going out and really demonstrating now for the first time in many, many years. Scholz has got to answer to this, the more so since German industry has really been crippled.
Yeah.
And the German people are worried about how they're going to heat their homes next winter. So that's the bottom line here. And without Germany, when push comes to shove in Ukraine, when Biden tries to figure out, well, who's going to be the countries that are willing, I'm afraid that German people will speak out and disable Scholz, remove him perhaps, and say, "No, we're not going to cooperate anymore. We're going to stand on our own feet." It's been 90 years since we caved to the Nazis. It's been 78 years since we realized we needed to behave ourselves and do what the Americans said. But now, look, it's too much. If you blew up the pipeline, which the evidence is very clear in my view, then we're going to stand on our own 2 feet. The other story that was put in the New York Times and Die Zeit, I suppose the most prestigious weekly in Germany, it doesn't hold water. Now, it's stupid. It can't be the real story of how this happened. Now, don't they realize that? Yeah, they realize that. Do they care? Not as long as it seizes the headlines for several days. Not as long as they can say, well, this is this other account of how it happened. Okay. So it's like the Democrats when Hillary Clinton was running for president in the fall of 2016. I'll give you an example. Alpha Bank. That sound pretty sinister to you? Alpha Bank. Where is it? It's in Moscow. Well, they conjured up this story using a whole bunch of techies to show, oh, there were communications between Alpha Bank and Trump headquarters in New York. Okay. Now, the techies that came up with this plan got paid really good for it. They said, well, we have to tell you, this is not going to hold water for more than 2 or 3 days. I mean, and Hillary Clinton's folks said, no problem. The election is just 10 days away. It'll grab headlines for 3 or 4 days. When it's exposed as fraudulent, it'll be on A17 of the New York, page A17 in New York Times, below the fold. Don't worry about it. Run with it. So they held their nose and they put out this cockamamie thing. So it doesn't matter if it's true or not. There are other purposes in putting out stories, however cockamamie.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, I mean, here Germany is giving us baby formula because we've shut down our baby formula factories over, fake COVID scares and unfortunately one baby had passed away. But I just keep thinking, like, here's our ally rushing us baby formula and we're blowing up their pipeline. We're wrecking their economy, wrecking their cash flow, because so much money is now going to heat their homes and keep their water warm and things like that. It's a real tragedy. It's a war crime and an attack on a multi-decade ally, business partner, friend, NATO nation. It's just unfortunate. I hope that Europe will hold him accountable and do an investigation. But like you say, the council may just say, we make the decision on who did it, and we decide it was a sailboat.
Well, I don't think they'll go that far. I think they'll say, oh, we're still investigating, and there'll never be any conclusive proof one way or the other. There's one other a little factoid that I think needs to be cranked in. As we said before, this plan was devised, and they found out they could physically do this, and everybody keep quiet about it, of course. In late 2001, okay? Now, why did they wait till September 2002? Well, as the autumn started coming, the Germans started getting really worried, not only about heating their homes, but about their industries. The Nord Stream pipelines had been shut down. Now, there are credible reports that the Germans went up to Moscow and said, look, we're really in a bind here. Would it be okay if we just turn the spigot on so that we don't freeze this winter? And we would maybe relax the sanctions or do some other, would that work? Now, German officials don't do anything without American officials knowing chapter and verse about it. So here's how I speculate. This was late August, early September. People getting really worried, and the business is, why can't we turn on Nord Stream 1 or Nord Stream 2? That one of them still exists, So I guess these crazy people around Biden said, well, we got a choice here. Looks like the Germans are beginning to falter a little bit. They care more about German industry than they care about defeating the Russians. Oh, how do we prevent this? More sanctions? No, sanctions are not going to work. We need something kinetic. Fancy word for blowing things up, okay? Well, that's how Cy Hirsch says it happened. They decided that they'd go kinetic, and then at the end of September, all of a sudden, it happens. So that's the way I would explain the curious timing of all this, that it was ready to go way early on, and then it was blown in September. And of course, once the pipeline is blown, there's no chance of turning it back on. I mean, hello, you can't turn it back on again. So there's no chance that the Russians and the Germans, my God, would sort of team up together in an arrangement where, like they had before, where the Germans were really happy for Russian gas at very cheap prices, and the Russians were delighted to get hard currency in return. That's how sinister this stuff is. And, you know, like you, I think it'll all come out in the wash, but the problem is probably not too soon to affect basic decisions that need to be made vis-a-vis Ukraine this spring.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe the truth will come out eventually. Ray McGovern, thank you so much for being on our show. If people want to learn more about you or read some of your writing, where can they find that?
Oh, thanks for asking, Steve. My son, who runs my website, really reams at me if I don't mention it. It's raymcgovern.com. Okay. Not hard. raymcgovern.com. And my son always says, now, Ray, now, Dad, when you mention this, always say, if you don't get it, you don't get it. But I'm too humble to say that on air. So just discard what I just said. raymcgovern.com. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, I will put it at the bottom. Thank you for coming on. Have a great rest of your day.